We've now moved into a section of this text on the elements of the Eightfold Path as factors to awakening. So the Eightfold Path, of course, is very familiar to us, and we can take some more nuanced looks at those 8 elements as factors of awakening. So, gate number 80. Right practice is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we arrive at the far shore. So you may be more familiar with this element as right effort. Here it's translated right practice. The original Sanskrit word became shogyo in Japanese, which is literally right practice. Right? We can see why, because the Sanskrit term could mean physical exertion or physical kind of exercise, right? So there's always been this feeling of training or cultivation, right, or exertion, exercise of some kind. So we're not just making an effort in order to be active and not be idle. It's a specific kind of activity. We're striving towards something, in this case, toward meeting our aspiration as Buddhas, right, Bodhisattvas. So we're moving toward our aspiration with our Bodhisattva vows. So back at gate 56, we talked about the 4 right exertions, and you might remember. To prevent unwholesomeness that has not yet occurred, to cause unwholesomeness that has already occurred to be extinguished, to bring about wholesomeness that has not yet occurred, and to promote the wholesomeness that's already here. So kind of a logical 4 things, right? In other words, we're in favor of wholesomeness. We're trying to let go of unwholesomeness. This is the way we can think about it. If it's here, we're going to let it go. If it's not here, we're going to make it arise, right? So that's one way to frame right effort or right practice. There's another way to frame it, which we'll talk about today, which we can think of as abandoning the wrong factors of this path. So one tries to abandon wrong view and to enter into right view. This is one's right effort. One tries to abandon wrong resolve and to enter into right resolve. This is one's right effort. One tries to abandon wrong speech and to enter into right speech. This is one's right effort. One tries to abandon wrong action and to enter into right action. This is one's right effort. One tries to abandon wrong livelihood and to enter into right livelihood. This is one's right effort. So this approach is not unrelated, of course, to the first one, right? This is maybe some specifics. Put some specifics on our practice of cultivating wholesomeness and abandoning unwholesomeness. So on a day-to-day, we probably need to abandon unwholesomeness by paying attention to the unhelpful stuff that arises for us, the unwholesome impulses we have, or habits maybe that we have, and actively choosing to do something else. Something arises and we go, what? Wait a minute, I'm not going to fall prey to that. I'm going to choose to do the more wholesome thing. So we're actively changing direction. We're actively reversing course. Here's this thing, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do the other. I'm going to do the opposite. So when we discover there's something about the Dharma that we don't understand, we can do some study. We can ask some Dharma friends or teachers. We can do some discernment about this particular point, whatever it is that's coming up in our practice. This is one of the reasons we start our Wednesday book group with a kind of an open session, and I just kind of say, what's bubbling for people, right? So as Dharma friends, we can help each other to fill the gaps, if you will. Our view of the world and what we encounter is gradually sort of reshaped by our understanding of what the Buddha taught, or what Dogen taught, based on how they saw the world, right? So when we realize that our aspiration has gone a bit off track, we can look a bit carefully at our motivations. We can come to Ryakusatsu that we do here every 30 days and recommit ourselves to living by precepts and living in Buddha's way. We can pay attention to the effect of our actions on ourselves and others, and just try to sort of shore up our vows. We can think about our aspiration, pay a little bit of attention to our aspiration, sort of come back to that a little bit. When we're concerned about our habits of speech, we can notice how we fall into unhelpful habits. We can decide what we'd rather do instead. Speech reflects our thinking, so we may have some habits of thinking to deal with, right? The downstream of that is what I'm going to say. So in my younger days, I was frequently fairly sarcastic in some unkind ways, not so helpful. And, I had some vague sense that I was doing that because I was unhappy, or I had some resentment, and somehow I wanted others to know that. Whether it was because I want you to know I'm angry at you, or I want the world to know that I'm unhappy and the world should somehow be treating me better, right? You have these sort of habits of thinking. So what comes out of your mouth? Things that aren't so helpful. So if the me of today could talk to the me of about 45 years ago, I would ask her whether, expressing unhappiness in that particular way was really doing anybody any good. Was I actually feeling better because of that? Or was I simply spilling my stuff onto other people? So, we can think a bit about what am I saying, and then where is that coming from? Because we know thinking leads to speech leads to action. So these things are not disconnected. So when we're concerned about our actions, we might look backwards, right, to speech and to thinking. So wrong action is often based on this kind of habituated thinking. It's a reflex that kicks in when we're in certain kind of situations. When I'm under stress, maybe I overeat. Or, I'm bored, so I kind of stir up trouble to entertain myself. I pit people against each other, maybe, just to, for the entertainment of that. If I see something I want, I get it any way I can, regardless of, outcomes for other people. So, when we're concerned about how we're supporting ourselves, whether that's materially or financially, well, that's probably the hardest of all of these five, right? Sometimes there isn't a lot we can do. If we need to support our families, we need to support ourselves. Job opportunities may be limited. We need to do something. It might not be the ideal job. As long as we're not actively breaking precepts by however we're making our livelihood, we may have to put up with something that isn't quite ideal. The job itself might be okay, but the circumstances might be difficult. The people we work with might not be the people we would choose. Not optimal in some cases. But chances are we can look around and see even a small way to do whatever it is we need to do in some more wholesome way. So maybe that means we can make some suggestions about a greener way to do business, or some small green thing we can do, some small ethical thing we can do. Maybe that means that there's small things we can do on our own to adjust our work or adjust our approach to work. Can I take the bus instead of driving that single occupant vehicle? Can I personally make best use of company resources so that I'm not personally dumping more stuff into the landfill? Can I offer some simple encouragement or support to my coworkers? It's amazing what a difference that makes, right? It makes the workplace more wholesome. If somehow we perpetuate the idea that we're not disconnected from each other, we're all working together towards something. I can't tell you what a difference that makes, especially in difficult times. There may be others in the workplace who also see that this is not an ideal situation for them. So how can we support each other? Including, by the way, how do we support the boss? Managing upward is a skillful thing to do. So things like these are specific actions we can take as we make some aspiration, take some effort to reverse unwholesomeness, right, and to cultivate wholesomeness. And also in the larger picture then, so, we have these specific things we can do. Here comes unwholesomeness, I'm going to do something else. In the larger picture, unwholesomeness doesn't arise. And we go, how can that be? We're surrounded in some cases by unwholesomeness. So, unwholesomeness doesn't arise because there's no subject and object in the largest possible view. There's no separate I who makes effort and takes action and carries a deluded view and worries about aspiration and is caught up in all of these things, right? So, on the level of day-to-day and the level of form, yes, we're confronted with all of these things. In the big picture, in the absolute picture, there's no I that's carrying delusion and feeling the effects of these things. So in this one unified reality, right effort is simply the total functioning of the universe. It's everything that's happening while the universe does what the universe does. So everything in the universe is 100% engaged in being what it is and in doing what it does in its Dharma position. And in the absolute view, that is right effort. So it's not that our individual effort is negated. It's that it's not the whole picture. Our individual effort is incredibly important. Otherwise, we wouldn't take vows, and we wouldn't have aspiration, and we wouldn't talk about precepts. And also, right, the rest of that view is, in the largest possible picture, the universe is 100% engaged in doing what it's doing, and that in itself is right effort. Because it can't be any other way. So when we study the Dharma, by immersing ourselves in this reality without separation, without duality, that is right effort, right? Complete simply immersing ourselves in what's going on. By dropping off body and mind, we can't help but make right effort, because we're doing that now without delusion, without hindrance, without obstacle. There is just 100% functioning. So, right practice is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we arrive at the far shore. So I find it helpful actually to think that right practice and right effort are the same thing. Practice is not separate from the rest of our lives, right? There's no point where we're making effort in our lives that's not practice. It's not separate from our daily functioning. So whatever it is we're doing at the moment, if we're fully engaged in it in a seamless kind of way, and we've dropped our hindrance and delusion and all of that stuff, that is right effort. It's 100% functioning, and that is right effort. So simply living and carrying out our regular activities is practice, and without our having to give them some special meaning as sacred, we can start to get kind of precious, right? Ooh, I'm washing the dishes. Ooh, I am mindfully sweeping the walk. Now we start having some ideas about what that effort is, right? What that activity is. That's a gap. Right there, there's a separation. There's I doing something, probably in some measure, in order to make myself feel like a bodhisattva. I'm going to take on this thing because then I'm going to feel like I'm doing right practice, whatever that means. Can we instead do that activity because that's what's going on in the universe at this moment, that's what people need from me, I'm going to seamlessly enter into that without some idea about I am an object, right? Drop off body and mind in that moment. Now we have right practice. Now we have right effort, right activity. So it's not that we're going to enter into some special sacred thing. Otherwise, cleaning the cat box would not be bodhisattva activity. Can we see cleaning the cat box as bodhisattva activity? I think that's that's something. Okay. So, according to this gate, then, that approach to our activities brings us to the far shore, right? This gate, the second half of this gate is about the far shore. So in other words, nirvana. Extinguishing of these burning fires of delusion and suffering. So in the early Buddhist teachings, this is a linear path, right? We practice, we make some effort, we're rewarded by leaping off the wheel of samsara, or the wheel of rebirth, and landing in nirvana. Landing on our feet in nirvana. In Soto Zen, we would take this gate to mean that right practice and nirvana rise together. So it's not we do something for some kind of reward, some better state somewhere down the road. Practice and nirvana, practice and awakening arise together. That's familiar territory for us, right? It's one of this unity of practice and awakening is one of Dogen's favorite themes. Talks about this a lot. So prior to Dogen, Shila, or an ethical life, was a prerequisite for samadhi, or concentration, and samadhi was a prerequisite for prajna, or wisdom. So first we established some ethical basis for living, in large part so we're not distracted by our compulsions to do unethical things. So first we lay that groundwork. Then we're able to practice, we're able to do sitting practice, we're able to have some concentration, and the outcome, the reward of that, in this approach is prajna, or wisdom. So it's something we get at the end of the deal. Dogen says prajna is the basis for everything. There's no prajna somewhere else down the line. Prajna is the basis for everything. Without prajna, we don't know how to make right effort. If the wisdom, if the awakening isn't already here, we don't know how to make right effort. We don't even know what that is. We don't have any desire to do zazen, because zazen is simply a manifestation of prajna. So if prajna was not here, we would not be sitting. We would not be practicing. He says that if we understand this, we are completely free. In other words, we arrive at the far shore. That in itself is nirvana. That in itself is awakening. So in the Bendowa, he says, thinking that practice and enlightenment are not one is no more than a view that is outside the way. In Buddhism, practice and enlightenment are one and the same. Because it is the practice of enlightenment, a beginner's wholehearted practice of the way is exactly the totality of original enlightenment. For this reason, in conveying the essential attitude for practice, it is taught not to wait for enlightenment outside of practice. So, if you're a beginner, you're doing the same zazen, you're awakening exactly the same as the person next to you and Buddha. As soon as we practice, we're not separate from awakening. So in a moment, we'll see another case of the practice of seniors and beginners coming together. We're going to come back to that in a minute. So not surprisingly, Dogen's comment on this gate comes at it from a non-dual point of view, because he lives his whole life from a non-dual point of view. So he says about this gate, right effort, as a branch of the path, is action that gouges out a whole body, and it is the fashioning of a human face in the gouging out of the whole body. It is to ride upside down around the Buddha hall, doing 1 lap, 2 laps, 3, 4, and 5 laps, so that 9 times 9 comes to 82. It is repeatedly to repay the benevolence of others, thousands and tens of thousands of times. It is to turn the head in any direction of the cross, vertically or horizontally. It is to change the face vertically or horizontally in any direction of the cross. It is to enter the master's room and to go to the Dharma hall. It expresses having met at Boshite Pavilion, having met at Usekire Peak, having met in front of the monks' hall, and having met inside the Buddha hall, there being 2 mirrors and 3 kinds of reflection. Okay, let's take this thing apart, because that's a lot. There's a lot happening there. So, right effort is a branch of the path, is action that gouges out a whole body, and it is the fashioning of a human face in the gouging out of the whole body. So this whole thing about gouging out eyes of Buddha and ancestors appears in various places in Dogen's writing. This is not the only place it shows up. It starts with his own teacher, Tendo Nyojo. Once when sitting in his abbot's quarters, Zen master Tendo Nyojo said, "Gouge out Bodhidharma's eyeball and use it like a mud ball to hit people." Okay, in Zanmai Zamai Fascicle, Dogen says, in the last several hundred years, my late teacher alone gouged out the eyes of the Buddhas and ancestors and sat therein. Few masters in China have been equal to him. So this image appears several times. In the Ikamyoju Fascicle, Dogen says gouging out Bodhidharma's eyeballs is thorough investigation, or henzan. It's like, okay. Gouging out Bodhidharma's eyeballs is thorough investigation. So gouging out eyeballs as right effort is thoroughly investigating this one unified reality, seeing the way Buddhas and ancestors see. Right? So in the case of the Ikamyoju Fascicle, Dogen is actually setting up a contrast in that particular text. In order to make a point, he's talking about pilgrimage, or traveling around to practice. So like Bodhidharma coming to China, or Chinese ancestors going back to India, at that point in the text, he's talking about this traveling around to practice, which sounds familiar from the Kanzo Zengi, right? Traveling around to practice. So he says that's not thorough investigation, or that that's not necessary for thorough investigation. It's not necessary to go somewhere else to practice, because all of reality is right here to investigate. It's like, where do we need to go to find reality? It's right here. So it's not like we need to go on pilgrimage, or we need to travel around in order to find something to investigate, right? Moment by moment, like here it is. So we don't have to go looking for that. The real thorough investigation is gouging out eyeballs, or as he says in the comment on this gate, gouging out the whole body and then fashioning a human face. In other words, manifesting our true nature, right? The true self in this human form. So, next part of his comment. It is to ride upside down around the Buddha hall, doing 1 lap, 2 laps, 3, 4, and 5 laps, so that 9 times 9 comes to 82. Crazy. Crazy stuff. So, there's another translation of this that says it is to ride an ox, or a water buffalo, backward, right into the Buddha hall, then doing 1 lap around the hall, 2 laps, 3, 4, or 5 laps, so that 9 times 9 equals 82. So that particular translator interprets Dogen as creating a sort of a nonsensical picture. You know, you're pretty sure when you come in here, nobody's going to ride a water buffalo in here backwards and start doing laps, or upside down, right, and start doing laps. So the point being, we shouldn't be worried about keeping track of numbers or things in our practice. We should just do what the moment calls for without having an agenda, without having a checklist. How many laps have I done upside down on a water buffalo, right? 9 times 9 equals 82. Well, you know, okay. For today, maybe. He says that's thorough investigation. So simply entering into the practice without some idea, without a checklist of high points, without something we need to achieve, something, a yardstick we need to use to compare. My practice is better than yours, right? So, of course, he's making this comment in the midst of, Dogen's making this comment in the midst of all of these gates that we've been talking about. 4 types of mindfulness, 4 types of correct effort, 4 modes of special powers, 5 faculties, 7 branches of awakening, 8-fold path, right? So all these, in the midst of all these numbers, here's Dogen saying, and by the way, ignore the numbers, according to this translator. So if we accept the theory that writing backwards or upside down around Buddha Hall until 9 times 9 equals 82 is nonsense, and we put it next to Dogen's insistence on thorough investigation right to the bottom of reality, then he's telling us, let go of our ideas about how the universe works and see instead what's actually there. So if we expect 9 times 9 equal 81, we have an idea about how the universe works. And maybe that's true. And what if it isn't? And like, we don't want to miss that, right? So we don't need to go on pilgrimage. We don't need to memorize formulas. We don't need to have some idea about what we're going to expect, of what we're going to encounter. That's not where our effort needs to go. Instead, instead of putting our energy into something which is a bit misguided like that, we just simply wholeheartedly enter into the activity of this moment. And that is thorough investigation, or right effort, or right practice. But there's another interpretation of this whole backwards water buffalo 9 by 982 thing. It says that it means we should be ready to undertake what cannot actually be done. It's not actually possible to ride a water buffalo upside down 5 laps around the Zendo and make 9 by 9 equal 82. So this interpretation says we should be completely ready to enter into what is not possible to actually do. Well, how do we know what's not possible to actually do? That's my idea. When you started sitting, you probably never thought you could sit for 50 minutes. That would have been entering into something which felt like it was impossible to do, and yet here you are, carrying out your practice. So we shouldn't be restricting our effort only to those things we think we can achieve. If we were doing that, nobody would ever sit sesshin, right? Because sitting 13 or 14 periods a day facing a wall seems like something monumental, and yet we do it. And the first time we do it, we go, oh, wait a minute. When I teach Zazen, when I used to do some of the beginning classes here, I would say to people, you can sit longer than you think you can. 50 minutes sounds intimidating. It sounds scary. Gee, I should start with 10 minutes and work up to 15 or 20. And then you sit 15, you think, well, I could do that, but I didn't think I could. It was purely my idea. So this interpretation says, don't restrict yourself to only those things which you think are possible, right? So if we do that, we have attachment to outcome. We have attachment to an agenda. I'm going to do this in order to achieve something or to prove that I can, or something. So thorough investigation is to let go of our ideas about our own limitations as human beings and as vessels of the Dharma. Dogen tells us sometimes, don't believe you're not a vessel of the Dharma. As soon as you think you're not, you're hindered in your practice. As soon as you think practice and awakening are not the same thing, there's a hesitation there, right? There's a hindrance there. There's a doubt there. So I think this is pretty encouraging, actually. Don't be afraid to enter into those things you think you can't actually do in this practice. So you can decide which of those interpretations make sense to you, if either one of them do. Either don't be afraid to do what you think you can't do, or don't enter into your practice with a numbers checklist. So you can decide if either of those is helpful. So next part says, it is repeatedly to repay the benevolence of others thousands and tens of thousands of times. So now we're moving into, in this comment, a series of illustrations of non-separation. So repaying the benevolence of others is completely interpenetrated functioning. It is entering into this thing without a subject or an object, without a you that's doing something kind for me, or an activity that has an outcome, right? Others are supporting us at the same time that we're supporting them within this network of interdependent origination. That's how that works, right? We don't get a choice. We don't have to decide, I'm going to, somehow support other beings and they're going to somehow support me. That's going on, man. That's already happening. So can we actually see that? Can we really deeply understand that that's the case? So, because of that, repaying benevolence happens tens of thousands of times, not just when I think you've done something nice for me and I'm going to do something nice for you. I mean, that's good. Gratitude is wonderful, and having some intention about helpful action is great. And also, right, it's happening anyway, because all beings are supporting us, and we're supporting all beings. So tens of thousands of times that benevolence is being repaid, simply by our carrying out our complete functioning. It's just the the way reality operates, right? So we're making this kind of right effort without even having to have some intention about it, which is interesting, right? There's a kind of right intention where we set some aspiration, but there's also a right effort, which is just the functioning of the universe. That is thorough investigation. So, it is to turn the head in any direction of the cross, vertically or horizontally. It is to change the face vertically or horizontally in any direction of the cross. So I gotta say, this bit is a bit obscure to me. I'm gonna make some speculations, and you can decide what you think about it. You kind of don't expect to find a cross in the middle of Dogen. That makes you kind of stop. Okay. So Dogen uses the phrases turning the head and changing the face elsewhere in his writings. This is another thing that comes up in other places. Those to me are also a little bit obscure. So putting it next to the rest of his comment on this gate and knowing that we're in the middle of this section about non-separation, I'm going to guess he's setting up an example of freedom of movement in any of the 10 directions, right? So we've got the north, south, east, west, we've got the points in between, and we have up and down. So we have 10 directions, which forms a cross. So freedom of movement in any direction around this set of directions, around this cross. So there's an interpretation of changing the face elsewhere in his writings that means awakening. So there's something happening about our freedom of movement and liberation within the 10 directions. So here it could mean that when we turn the head in any of the 10 directions, or we move through the world with this individual body and its karmic conditions, we also show the face. We also show our awakened nature or Buddha nature in the 10 directions. So we can't not do that, right? So as the head and the face are not separate, just as our karmic selves and our Buddha nature are not separate, we move through the world showing these things in the 10 directions because we can't not do that. That's my speculation. You can decide. It is to enter the master's room and go to the Dharma hall. So now we're back to this non-duality between senior practitioners and beginners. So, senior practitioners and the entire Sangha. If you had Dharma transmission, you got to go to the teacher's quarters, and here's some kind of special teachings, right? Gave you a bit of a advantage. You got to go and meet with the teacher and hear special things. Ask your questions, have a private meeting about your practice or about the Dharma, the things that were on your mind. But everybody was expected to go to the Dharma hall to hear the teacher's talks for the whole Sangha, for the whole community. So if you were in the Sangha, you were expected to go. Doesn't matter how experienced or not you were. So, thorough investigation, we might say, is to carry out your responsibilities as a senior member of the Sangha, and also not to think you're too good to do what the rest of the Sangha is doing. You know, you can't skip the community talk just because you have some role, or you have some status, or you achieved something, right? It's not like, well, I have transmission, I don't need to practice anymore. We all know that's not the case. This is a lifetime thing, moment by moment practice. So we have this non-duality. No matter where you are on what we might consider to be a linear path, awakening is already there, practice is already there, we all practice together. It expresses having met at Boshite Pavilion, having met on Usukire Peak, having met in front of the monks' hall, and having met inside the Buddha hall, there being 2 mirrors and 3 kinds of reflection. So Dogen is incorporating by reference here a koan story. Seppo addresses the assembly. I have met you at Boshite Pavilion. I have met you on Usekide Peak. I have met you in front of the monks' hall. Hofuku asks Gakko, let us forget for a while the front of the monks' hall. What about the meetings at Boshite Pavilion and Usekide Peak? Gakko runs back to the abbot's quarters. Hofuku lowers his head and goes into the monks' hall. Well, that seems almost as obscure as the first one, right? Okay, Dogen talks about this story again in other places, including Shobogenzo Komyo. Great Master Shingaku of Mount Seppo once told his monks, I met you in front of the monastery. This was the expression of his enlightenment and the true expression of himself. He wanted to teach the monks the real meaning of the word monastery. Once Seppo's disciple Hofuku asked Gakko, another disciple, our master insists on only using the expression, I met you in front of the monastery, to explain his teaching, but never mentions Boshite or Usekide. Then Gakko quickly returned to the master's quarters and Hofuku to the monastery. They understood the meaning and purpose of their master's teaching. By returning to their respective dwellings, they showed that enlightenment is only to meet our real selves. This is the real meaning of meeting in front of the monastery. Similarly, Great Master Shino of Jinzuin said, the monk in charge of the kitchen enters the kitchen. This expression surpasses the meaning of time. Well, that gives us some context, right, for this story. Boshu Pavilion and Useki Peak are two scenic places on Mount Seppo where people went to do meditation. These are two places they would go to sit. That's why these two things are being called out. So the teacher says he's met his disciples in all of these places where they engage in zazen, right? So wherever people are sitting doing zazen, this is where he's meeting them. So the word for meeting here includes a kanji that includes some kind of mutuality, right? So again, non-separation of subject and object. There's no I meeting you. There's just meeting. There's just zazen. So the teacher says that wherever they meet in zazen, or wherever they understand that there is only one awakening within this one unified reality, that's the monastery, right? They don't have to mention the other scenic places on the mountain, because he says, he never talks about these other two places. He says, I meet you in front of the monastery, but he never talks about these other places. So you don't have to, right? Because wherever we enter into this understanding that there's only one awakening in this one unified reality, that's the monastery. So these guys don't even need to physically be in the same place. They don't have to be on the peak. They don't have to be in the zendo or on the monastery or in their quarter. It doesn't matter. They have entered into this one space of awakening in this one unified reality. So they can even be in their own quarters. So, they each go back to their own places. So-and-so goes back to the monastery. So-and-so goes into the abbot's hall. So-and-so goes into the kitchen because he's the tenzo, right? Even there. So they can be in their own quarters and still be meeting, right? Or not be separate. And when Dogen says this expression surpasses the meaning of time, he's pointing out that people in different times as well as different spaces are still included in this space, right? Still not separate within this awakening, within this one unified reality. So again, thorough investigation or right effort is not limited to one space, and it's not limited to one time. We have all entered into this functioning, so there is no separation. Finally, the end of Dogen's comment. Finally, the end of Dogen's comment. It expresses having met inside the Buddha hall there being two mirrors and three kinds of reflection. So you might think, well, there's no mirror in here. What's going on? Subject and object are reflecting each other like two mirrors. So these are our two mirrors. So we could make a distinction and say there is a subject and an object, but we can also say these two are reflecting each other. So in a way, they're not actually pulled apart. Also, these two mirrors are undivided reality of this moment. So there are three reflections. So there's a subject and an object and a going beyond subject and object. Right? And as we know, we have to keep peeling that onion. Then we have to let go of the idea that there is going beyond subject and object. And then we have to let go of that. Right? So we could say there's a sort of an unlimited number of reflections going on. So there's subject and object, and there's going beyond subject and object, and there's everything that unfolds from that. So individual people are meeting and talking and sitting, and there's also the reality that includes all the people and all the activity. So we can make a distinction. You and you and you and you and you are sitting or meeting or talking, and also the third reflection is those aren't separate things. So thorough investigation or right effort operates from the point of view of individuals and forms and subject and object, and also from the point of view of emptiness, non-separation, non-duality, right? Both of those are true. One does not obstruct the other. One does not negate the other. We hold both of these things. Reality includes both of these things. So it's not one or the other. It's difficult for us to see both at the same time. In our limited human form, usually we see one or the other, but they don't obstruct each other in any way. They're all included in this one unified reality. So, Dogen's complete comment, again, let's put it back together. Right effort as a branch of the path is action that gouges out a whole body, and it is the fashioning of a human face and the gouging out of the whole body. It is to ride upside down around the Buddha hall, doing 1 lap, 2 laps, 3, 4, and 5 laps, so that 9 times 9 comes to 82. It is repeatedly to repay the benevolence of others, thousands and tens of thousands of times. It is to turn the head in any direction of the cross, vertically or horizontally. It is to change the face vertically or horizontally in any direction of the cross. It is to enter the master's room and to go to the Dharma hall. It expresses having met at Boshite Pavilion, having met on Usekide Peak, having met in front of the monks' hall, and having met inside the Buddha hall, there being 2 mirrors and 3 kinds of reflection. So that's a lot of territory. Okay, so thorough investigation or right practice or right effort is about immersing ourselves in the complete functioning of this moment, doing that without any gaps, without creating any separation. So this is not like investigating with the intellect only, doing research in books, or looking up facts or that kind of thing. This does not negate that kind of Dharma study. It says that's not the whole story, right? Thorough investigation is completely entering into something in body and mind. So Uchiha Roshi figured this out like really early on for him in his practice life. So he says, by studying Western philosophy academically, you can pretty much learn what it's all about, but Buddhism is another matter. To investigate and understand Buddhism and Zazen thoroughly, I became a monk. My becoming a monk was something of a fabricated means for doing Zazen because it was easier to do Zazen if I took on the lifestyle of a monk. I had been an intellectual doing little besides reading and thinking, but I was determined to put all my energy into this practice. Later I wrote a poem I called The Poem for Leaving Home. Like a sunbeam on a bright autumn morning, I would like to become completely one, body and mind, with transparent, wholehearted practice. So, when we look at his poem, like a sunbeam on a bright autumn morning, I would like to become completely one, body and mind, with transparent, wholehearted practice. The sunbeam is transparent, right? So he's talking about his transparent, wholehearted practice. And when we think about a sunbeam, we think, well, that's transparent. We can see through that, right? It just kind of shines the way it shines. So it's carrying out complete function with no gaps. When that sunbeam comes in the window, or wherever you are, it's doing what it does with no gaps. It's not disconnected from the sun. It's not disconnected from what it lands on. There's an interesting way we can see that connection, right? It's doing what it does, but it's not disconnected from anything. So we can see individual sunbeams in relation to shadows or something in the air like water vapor, right? Or dust particles or something. We can see a beam. So we can distinguish a sunbeam. But in the absence of those things, how do we distinguish a sunbeam from the rest of the light in the sky? There's just light, right? So we can't, until there is something that points out an individual sunbeam, we can't distinguish that, from sunlight overall. So sometimes it has form, sometimes it doesn't have any self-nature of its own. It's completely not separate. But in both cases, right practice is there. So when we see that sunbeam, of course, it's not separate from the light in the sky. It's just we notice it. We can sort of put a boundary around it, or think we can, right? So the question for us is, how can we abandon unwholesome activities and turn instead toward becoming one with transparent, wholehearted practice, right? How do we become the sunbeam? I think it's interesting he picks a sunbeam. There's a certain kind of energy there. It's like we feel positive about a sunbeam. What do we like to think as we were going through the world? We were generating some warmth, generating some light, as a distinct being, as a distinct form, and yet not separate from the light in the sky. It's an interesting way to consider, I think, right practice, right effort. What would you like to say? Would you tell me what time it is? I didn't put the clock.
It's 5 till 11.
5 till, okay, that's a good stopping point. So what would you all like to say? Let's start with people in the room about thorough investigation, right effort, right practice, water buffalo, running around the ceiling, whatever is on your mind today. Toku.
Well, I want to say this, just in memorial on Hunt, that there was a saying he had, which I remember, which seems to fit this, where he says, there is no such thing as enlightened people, just enlightened actions.
Interesting. There's no such thing as enlightened people, just enlightened actions. And useful for our topic today, I think, right? In that action, enlightenment is there. So if there's no gap, if there's no subject and object, there is simply awakened action, beneficial action, wholesome action, right?
We have a paradox in the way you presented the material. Because on the one hand, you were talking about, if I am doing this, there's separation. And then you're talking about how using effort, you're making an effort towards some goal. So how do you work with that paradox?
Well, that's the thing, right? I mean, that's the question. how do we hold both of those things? So on the one hand, we are, as bodhisattvas, we are aspiring towards beneficial action, skillful action, wholesome action, ethical action, and also, we can also see the entire functioning of the universe as right effort, and yet we know within the functioning of that universe there's suffering. Beings are suffering, right? So we get to hold both of those things. I'm not going to give you an answer because there isn't an easy answer, right? I mean, our whole practice is to dance in that intersection and think, I need to make the effort I need to make, and also, there's an I making an effort, and also. So how do we hold that?
And also there is no I.
And also there's no I. Well, this is the thing, right? So how do we hold that? If we see the way Buddha sees, we see both of those things happening, and they don't obstruct each other. That's what's really interesting to me, is they don't hinder each other. There's two things that appear to be at least not the same, and the reality is they don't hinder each other. So how do we function in the world as bodhisattvas with the understanding that there's something bigger than I'm functioning in the world as a bodhisattva, because that's my idea, right? Yeah. Isn't it a wonderful practice? What would others like to say?
I think you already mentioned that, and probably that answers your question as well. When we describe transcending the duality, now Advaita is a very old concept across multiple scriptures. And to be observant of the duality, both subject and the object, that's the way you maintain that what we call the yogastha state, actually, where you see the actions being performed by yourself, but you still see it because you have transcended that. That's the way, probably, you already mentioned that in your conversation. That's all I have to contribute.
Well, that's helpful. And I think we have to be really careful about words like transcendence, and I'm not criticizing your use of it. I'm saying we have to be careful because it feels like transcendence means we somehow go somewhere else.
You use that word as well. So I think in the flow, you didn't mention that.
Yep.
I made a note of that as well.
Absolutely.
Because you use the phrase of when you were talking about the two mirrors and the three kinds of reflections.
Yep.
And then you use the sentence subject and the object, and then you use the word transcendence.
Right.
So I noted it.
I'm pointing at me as well. All of our words. It's easy to get caught up in the words.
It's the sometimes we kind of tangle ourselves in words.
Language
language is a barrier.
Language is a problem. Well, sometimes language is a problem.
Yeah.
Dogen would say language isn't a problem. He says language goes in all directions.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'll start with me by saying I use that word, but we have to be careful with that because it feels like, oh, we're leaving this plane and going up here, and somehow this is where we live in this world of abstract, empty something, and that subject and object are not real or they are negated, and that's actually not it. We get to hold.
I think once you mention the key word prajna, which is the wisdom, that kind of defines the whole totality. Right? Because once that's the real word rather than using the transcend. Because prajna paramita, right? So that's the focus is there.
Right.
Well, transcend can also mean going beyond limits.
Yes.
It's going.
So
that's how we have
to
to
see it. It's not the negation of the other, but an expansion.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's the globality, it's the universality of the whole. It's the interconnectedness. So what we were talking about, it's the dependency right now.
That's a helpful way to think about it. Is we're going beyond limits. It's like when we say Buddha's way is unsurpassable. Doesn't mean it's the best religious practice out there. There's nothing outside of it, right? So there's nothing outside of it. There's no place we can step outside of Buddha's way, one unified reality, total functioning universe, whatever you want to call that thing, right? So it includes everything, and there's I like going beyond limits as a thing. Did you want to?
I just wanted. I mean, the mirror, facing a mirror. It's a really powerful visual metaphor. Just thinking about. As soon as you face two mirrors, everything disappears in between.
Yep.
And so there's that going beyond immediately, and it's just perfect.
It's a great image, isn't
Yes,
it?
it is.
Because I mean, here I'm facing you, we can't help but reflect each other,
Right.
and yet there's, you know, and what happens when we sit zazen in front of a wall? Can we see the wall as the mirror, right? There's subject and object, kind of, I'm seeing the wall, but really, what's in the middle? It's a really interesting thing to work with. I liked it a lot too. When I encountered it, I thought that's a really helpful, 2 reflections and 3 reflections is a really helpful way to frame that, I think. So thank you for
that
that.
metaphor in what's it called, the Sermon of the Golden Lion. You all know that was a major one in mine only school. So you imagine a room with mirrors on all the walls and ceiling and floor, and then you put a Buddha in the middle.
Yep.
And that becomes sort of a metaphor of the infinite expanse of Buddha nature.
Right, right, and yet there's only one Buddha. So I mean, they're reflections of each other, but they're also not separate, because Dogen would say there's only one Buddha. It has, you know, mirrored manifestation, but there's only one, right? So that's another. I think this whole mirror thing is kind of an interesting.
Something to reflect on.
It's a really helpful picture, isn't it, for something we have a hard time picturing. Right. Bart, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, this is a thought that's still kind of percolating, but I really thought it was interesting the way they kind of describe like the connection between thought, speech, action, right? And trying to be able to think about it in those runs, because a lot of times you spend sitting, you can really find the specter of Mara hiding behind every part of myself that I thought to be most wholesome and pure, right? So it's like kind of there's like, nope, I'm there too. It's there too, right? And so these are things that you kind of start seeing a little bit more, and so the idea is like, I think that unwholesomeness in thought is, I don't know, maybe somebody who's more practiced doesn't experience it as much, but it's often and constantly there, and but it's also, to what extent it goes from here to out of here, and from out of here to something that's far more destructive. And I think that with some elements of kind of practice, it's one of those things that I kind of find a little bit to be a challenge. I not too long ago, I saw a person who I knew, and he went on. There was somebody that he knew that in a previous job that I didn't necessarily connect with that well, and apparently he had a negative experience, and then just went to want to talk to me. I mean, there's a part you feel a little bit of that almost belieffulness, and they're like, ooh, yes, and then as I saw, I caught it, and it's like, oh, okay, I'm sorry that you're going through that, and going through the but it's like, but around, let's say, close friends, or around my wife, or something like that, there's far more unfocused moments, right? And then that kind of thing that stops between, from here to here, sometimes there's many more unfocused moments where that just, that part, this is let's prevent the unwholesome thing that's in here from coming out of here. It's a little bit harder to sometimes, and I guess that's kind of why we keep coming back to a vow of repentance. But I think with my own practice, that's something that I find to be a regular challenge, is to be able to maintain that level of awareness to keep some of those darker parts from getting out into the world.
Well, so job 1, as you say, is the awareness of that. If we're speaking without thinking, we don't have the opportunity to make a pivot, maybe, and do something wholesome. But I think it's also helpful if we've got close friends or family that we can talk that stuff over with. That we can feel like we just need to vent, and somebody's going to just hold that, and not take it personally, and not take it anywhere else, and just recognize this is for us. Sometimes that's a certain kind of discernment, right? We articulate something, we go, oh, there it is. If I have to articulate it, I get to reflect on it in a particular way, whereas if it's just bouncing around in here unformed, it can be much harder actually to see clearly and to identify and to know what's going on. So I think, if we have people we sort of have that personal contract with, I'm going to dump stuff and you're not going to take it personally, you're not going to go anywhere with it, and you're still going to love me. Even though I'm showing you, Mara in my brain. I think that's really helpful, because if we've got to do this and be worried all the time, We don't get to, I think in some ways we don't get to do the thorough investigation. Sometimes we have to do thorough investigation with our Sangha friends, or our families, or our teachers, or something, right? So I think being aware of what's the downstream ramification, what's coming out of my mouth is really important, but also I think what's coming out of my mouth is a tool for discernment in some ways. I think we need people we can do that with. That's not, if we're doing that kind of with some intention and with some care, I think that's not necessarily a wholesome activity. And sometimes people will come to us and they want to vent, and what do we do with that? Can we just hold it? Can we just help them do discernment with that? As you say, I'm really sorry that's happening to you. Doesn't mean I think what you're saying is right. Let's go, light a torch. I'm sorry you're suffering. I'm sorry that's happening. Now you have to say that in a way people can hear. I'm sorry your dukkha is overtaking. No. Unless it's a Sangha friend. It's like, no. I'm really sorry that's happening to you. That really sounds tough. Okay, you want to have a cup of coffee and talk about that? You don't have to give them advice. You just have to hold the space, right? I think so often we want to jump in and solve the problem. Guilty. You want to jump in and solve the problem. Oh, what you should do is that really the skillful, wholesome thing in that moment, or is that me wanting my ego to be soothed because I solved somebody's problem and I'm the hero? Sometimes all we can do is, I'm really sorry that's happening to you. Are you getting enough sleep? Is there someone you can get some help with about this? Because it doesn't have to be this one. I mean, we all do pastoral care in a certain way. If we're a member of Sangha, or if we've got friends or family or anything, sometimes the bodhisattva action is, to do that kind of just coming alongside and let them do the discernment about Mara in their brains. Talking about reflection, can we take in what they're saying and reflect it back? So what I'm hearing is, you're really struggling with this. Is that right? Yeah. Oh! Now I see where my problem was because I'm so caught up in this, If we can help people with discernment, I think that is thorough investigation in a kind of a particular way. So I'm glad you kind of brought up that whole thinking to speech to action thing, because boy, that can be a cascade. Suddenly we're doing something and go, why did I just throw that across the room? What's going on? Okay, back up, because it starts here, right? It starts here. Did you have a hand up? Anybody else in this room something to say today?
So was Carl Rogers a bodhisattva?
It's the human psychologist.
No,
He's
Carl
the guy
Rogers was a therapist who believed that it's therapeutic to simply listen deeply to a person and not give advice.
Could be. Moment by moment, what are the circumstances call for it? That's why this is tough. It's tough to know. Here's somebody in training to do exactly this.
Yeah,
you may have some things to say about that.
I mean, what you were just saying is actually really quite helpful, because that's something I've been kind of trying to find the balance in, right? Just sitting there and listening, and then part of your responsibility is to help them figure out what to do, how to change it, right? And kind of making that pivot can you get into your head a lot, right? Okay, when do I need to start giving solutions, or at least pushing people into that place? And talking earlier about what did you say? It was during the actual talk. It was when we try too hard to be like a bodhisattva, right? We get that gap, right? And I think that taking a step back from that hope really is a helpful guidance for me to make sure.
Yeah. Well, at some point when that conversation becomes about me rather than about the person I'm listening to, right? And that's when okay, wait a minute. Other things in this room before we ask people home? All right, Sawyer, I'm going to ask you to help me because I can't see
a hand
people.
up. Can you go to speaker
Maybe
view?
you want to either help call on people or just tell people they should unmute and speak. You're all very small at this point, so who's got something to say at home?
Hey Hoko, this is Fusats again. Thank you for your teaching. It was so much in that, but one of the things that stood out for me was the non-differentiation between newcomers and people that have been in the Sangha. So I really appreciate, the whole talk was essentially about non-differentiation and not separate. But again, that's one that stood out for me that I'm always appreciative of when I'm seeing new faces coming in. That takes it really back to the root and the core that we're not separate, we're the same. And then the visualization that I received inside the Zendo and the Sangha, when we all sit together, it's the same. So I really appreciated that piece, and it's very, I think for people that are coming into practice, encouraging that they're, just because they see somebody that's been there for 20, 30, 50 years, we're all doing the same thing. So that was encouraging. So thank you for your teaching this morning. And it was just a lot. That's just one of the things that stood out for me.
Well, and of course, you teach beginners too, I think. So, they don't believe you when you say, your zazen is the same as mine. Your awakening is the same as mine. We're entering into the same space. They go, no. You got to practice and do this and then get better at it. It's like there's no getting better. Your knees may hurt you a little less. Your distraction may be a little bit less, but the core of this thing is not different. So I do think that's encouraging, and we need to help beginners. I think beginners need to hear that, but it's a while until they believe you. Who else has something to say?
And it's also good because it keeps the people that have been there for a while from thinking we're special.
Absolutely. Well, there's more than one way to practice with something called beginner's mind, which would be another whole talk. Like, what is that really? Good. Thank you for that. Other folks with comments, questions, reflections?
Brian's hand.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Go ahead, Brian.
Just a quick observation. When we were talking, or you were talking about the, on the one hand, I have to exert right effort, and on the other hand, there is no I, and that seeming paradox. It reminded me, I hadn't thought of it in this way before, but just a simple observation again, it reminded me of those kind of child games, these simple line drawings that you can see in two ways. So they're a two-dimensional drawing, but if you look at it this way, the cube, for example, pops out to the left. And if you look at it this way, the cube pops out to the right. And there's no way to see both of those at the same time. And yet they're just lines on a paper that in no way obstruct each other. So I thought for me that it just popped in my mind like, oh, it's kind of like that.
Yeah, exactly. And Hojo-san has used those drawings, the old lady and the young lady, in some of his publications. So you're right on. And isn't it interesting, as you say, that those are simply lines on page, right? We're seeing those lines and we're creating something here that goes, oh, that's a cube, oh, that's a person, oh, that's a candlestick, whatever that is, and it's hard for us to see two things at the same time and yet, right? So I do think that's a helpful image. That's a helpful reminder. I'm glad you pointed us there. Because there's lots of those drawings around, right? Pick your favorite. It illustrates the point. Very good. Other comments, reflections from people at home? Anything else this morning? Everyone good? Okay. All right. So, I'm going to pitch back to Hoshin. We can do our closing chant and move on to tea time. So, thanks everybody.